Right, so we are now recording. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. If you have not already done so, please just make sure that you mute your mic. We are going to be recording this and uploading this to our official Somerville Prevention Services channel after this is over. So if you know of anyone who didn't get a chance to join us today for the live version of this, please do refer them to our YouTube channel, which again is Somerville Prevention Services. My name is Kira Vaughan. I am the Substance Use Prevention Coordinator for City of Somerville, and I am your official lecturer for tonight. Thank you again so much for joining us. If this is your first time with us in one of these presentations, we will be having moments for questions and answers throughout the presentation, and we will also have time at the end for questions as well. So that being said, thank you so much for coming to our Introduction to Psychedelics community training tonight. And we're going to go ahead and get started and just kind of go over a few of our objectives. So we will be talking about what are psychedelics, the different types of psychedelics that exist out there, a brief history of psychedelics, what they do, some decriminalization and legal things that are kind of going on right now, as well as talking about the role of psychedelics when it comes to mental health and also harm reduction. So let me just see here. Just 1 second, please. I'm actually going to, I think, need to do something here for a moment. Okay. Thank you for waiting through that technical difficulty. We have just come to our first Ask the Audience question, which is, what substances come to mind when you hear the word psychedelic? So I'm going to give people a couple of seconds to just throw their answers into the chat box. And we have some answers slowly coming in. Shrooms, yep, definitely. LSD, another correct answer there, yes. Anyone else want to contribute any answers tonight? Acid, yes, that is also technically a psychedelic. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, hallucinogens? Interesting choice. We're actually going to go into that a little bit more in our next slide, but thank you so much for our audience members who just submitted some answers. So to give a slightly more broad definition of psychedelics, psychedelics are actually a subclass of hallucinogens, meaning they fall into the hallucinogen family. Now, what psychedelics do is alter reality in a way that the experiences that we might have in our current day-to-day lives are no longer familiar to us. So this could be severe auditory or visual or even hearing audio-based hallucinations, and also other forms of psychosis that we will get into a little bit further on in the course of this presentation. Another important thing to mention about psychedelics is just in terms of how they are ingested. So psychedelics, we can eat them, they can be smoked, and they also can be injected. And depending on the way in which you are putting psychedelics into your body may actually impact the severity of the symptoms that you later experience based on that substance. And again, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we continue to move on with these slides. So for the sake of tonight's presentation, I have actually broken down psychedelics into basically 3 different groups. And we are going to be starting off by talking about the first group, which I'm calling synthetic psychedelics, otherwise known as man-made psychedelics. So the first one that we most commonly think about is LSD, which is also known as acid. This is also in turn followed by MDMA, which also is referred to as ecstasy and Molly. Those of us who are here in Boston, I think we've been hearing quite a bit about ecstasy and Molly in the last, I'd say probably 5 to 8 years. LSD a little bit less so, but definitely both are kind of found in the Boston area at this time. And to continue on to our next selection, there are actually psychedelics that are found kind of just naturally in nature that are plant-based. So this is a fairly unusual one, but we have Please forgive me if I mispronounce this and butcher the pronunciation. Ayahuasca, which is also known more commonly as DMT. This is made from a vine found in the Amazon. The interesting thing about this is that this is actually the only psychedelic that is currently really mostly being used by middle-aged individuals. And I will be getting into more psychedelic user demographics later on, but just wanted to point that out about DMT. Magic mushrooms, AKA shrooms, peyote, and another one called salvia, also known as magic mint, Sally D, etc., etc. So all of these different plant-based psychedelics typically have been found in, I'd say, starting in Mexico, kind of going throughout Central and South America. That's where the majority of these are found. And then finally, we have another group of psychedelics that are also man-made, but these were originally created for the purposes of being anesthetics, basically to help people and animals actually fall asleep during surgeries. So the first one is GHB, also known as liquid G. And we also have ketamine, which for those of us who work in substance use, mostly ketamine is a substance of choice found kind of in like the southern part of America, kind of in rural Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, just due to its availability because there was a lot of rural agriculture out there. And then we also have, I'm going to mispronounce this again, excuse me, phencyclidine, also known more commonly as angel dust or PCP. And again, this is, I think, not something that people realize was originally marketed as an anesthetic, but it was actually replaced by ketamine, which in turn has been replaced by other anesthetics for humans. So let's talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics here. So as you might have inferred from one of the earlier slides that we just went through, certain naturally produced psychedelics, like peyote especially, for instance, they've been used by many different indigenous tribes in North and Central South America for thousands of years, typically for religious or spiritual ceremonies. Now, we start to see a shift in terms of what we now kind of commonly think of psychedelics being. And around 1938, when LSD was, frankly, I believe, created completely by accident by a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann, who was pictured here on the right. So he discovered this, like I said, in 1938, but he didn't actually discover its full effects until 1943. I still to this day am unsure of how this happened, but he accidentally ingested some of it and then began to have the world's first documented acid trip on a bicycle on his way home from work. So after that period of discovery in the early 40s, we enter the period of the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, this was the Cold War era, and we start to have American CIA experiments start to happen with LSD due to its potential use as a psychological weapon. This project was known as Project MK Ultra. So this project ultimately went pretty defunct just due to the risks associated with LSD. And when Project MK Ultra became public knowledge in the 1970s, the resulting public kind of shock and scandal led to the complete criminalization of LSD and all other psychedelics in the country. However, in some ways, this legal ban came a little bit too late. Psychedelics had already started to become popular in the 1960s, especially we see here amongst San Francisco's hippie counterculture movement. This also then continued on into the 1970s. And we still see a lot of the pop culture of that time being strongly influenced by psychedelics like the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, and a lot of other very commonly known artists and musicians of the time. Now, since then, I would say its use has tapered down. I'm going to get into the modern day use of psychedelics a little bit later on in the course of this presentation. But before we do that, here's another Ask the Audience question. What do you think psychedelics could do? We already went over maybe a little bit of this earlier, but just want to get some audience feedback here. So I'm going to wait a couple of seconds and see which answers come into the chat box. Excuse me, you just got a, for those of you who are not looking at the screen, please do not look at the screen. I just actually cheated and gave you all some answers a little bit ahead of time. So I'm seeing here psychedelics can be used as a mood stabilizer, maybe specifically for helping depression. That is definitely something we'll get to later on in the presentation. Anyone else? Okay, got a couple more answers coming in the chat box here. Euphoria, producing euphoria or terror. Yes, absolutely. And that is actually a lovely segue into our next slide, which I'm sorry if you got a sneak peek of this already. Euphoria does range, it falls upon a range of symptoms and what you can experience, but we tend to put the extreme spectrum effects as being either a sense of complete euphoria, as mentioned earlier by our very knowledgeable audience, or complete and total paranoia, psychosis, et cetera, et cetera. Some other things that people might not be aware of happening when it comes to psychedelic use. Oftentimes there is major increased heart rate, which can lead to a major increase in body temperature, sweating. Dehydration is also very common when it comes to psychedelic use. And mind you, again, psychedelic use can range on a spectrum, just like any other sort of substance, but when we are talking about chronic and fairly extreme psychedelic use, we are not just even looking at the potentially of you being addicted to it. We are also potentially looking at psychedelic flashbacks, major severe depression. I'll get into that a little bit more in detail later on, as well as some fairly complicated psychosis symptoms. And it's an interesting range because I think I could make the argument that for most modern day Americans, in terms of looking for the impacts of psychedelic use, they would probably be much preferring the euphoric experience versus the psychotic experience. But obviously there is no guarantee of what sort of experience you were going to have when you were choosing to ingest this kind of substance into your body. And that is one of the reasons why we are fairly concerned about it. So here are a couple of other things to point out about psychedelic use. There is a particularly interesting phenomenon that happens, that the medical term of which is synesthesia, meaning that you may be seeing sounds or hearing colors as musical notes. Some other people might experience synesthesia due to other neurological reasons, but psychedelics definitely, like I said, have that significant impact on altering our sense of reality. You may feel more creative, imaginative, more open, more socially confident. And again, as we mentioned earlier, you could feel extremely euphoric, but you might also feel extremely paranoid or severely, severely depressed. You may feel as though you're having an out-of-body experience. A lot of people who have tried psychedelics have reported feeling almost as if they were floating. And that, again, on the other hand, might also be replaced by a sensation of extreme panic or fear. So most psychedelics effects, they can begin maybe about 20 minutes to an hour after you've ingested, but the effects can last for a considerably longer period of time, depending on what you've ingested and how you've ingested it. There is also the potential for and thankfully this is rare, but there is a condition called HPPD, where chronic psychedelic use can actually cause what is essentially lifelong psychosis issues, where you are going to be experiencing hallucinations long after you have had any kind of psychedelic substance in your body. So that is definitely something to be very mindful of. Now, before I continue onwards, I think it's also important to mention the use of psilocybin. So psilocybin is typically found in magic mushrooms, which you might have seen this word associated with that definition a few slides before this one. And psilocybin is something that we are extremely interested in researching, because psilocybin, in combination with therapy and other behavioral health interventions, may actually help with decreasing depression and anxiety symptoms, but we are still fairly early on in our research when it comes to this. And again, every single person is going to react to both psilocybin and psychedelics in general in a very different way. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I definitely want to talk about the demographics about what psychedelic users are looking like currently in America. So most psychedelic users are typically younger. So a lot of people are reporting first psychedelic use, I'd say typically between the ages of 18 to 25. Psychedelic users have very historically been young, white, college-educated individuals. But in recent years, other population groups, especially other ethnic groups, have definitely begun to use psychedelics as well. Psychedelics are used very heavily for people who are partying or clubbing. This is especially true amongst the MSM and LGBTQIA community. For those of you who are not aware of what MSM stands for, that is males who are having sex with other males. I would say, based on my own personal clinical experience of working with psychedelic users, definitely young college students in Boston, there is definitely some pretty heavy psychedelic use happening at the moment. However, I will also point out that even to this day, psychedelics are still being used for the purposes of seeking spiritual and or mental enlightenment, or even people who are kind of looking to expand their creativity. So that is something else to keep in mind as well. Now, we also need to talk about decriminalization in the 21st century because that is a continuously growing movement in this country. So Oregon became the first state to legalize use of mushrooms, specifically mushrooms, for medical purposes on basically November of 2020. So this is a relatively recent thing. We also have a lot of individual cities that have also begun the decriminalization process of mushrooms, again, strictly for medical purposes. We are not looking at cities or states or counties that are just wholesale decriminalizing all psychedelic use. We are really trying to focus on specifically looking at the impacts of psilocybin for mental health treatment, which actually brings us to our own city, city of Somerville. We actually, again, just unanimously had the city council vote to decriminalize the use of entheogenic plants, AKA, again, natural found in nature, psychedelic plants, fungi, etc. And that was January 2021, just this year. So again, this is something that we are now starting to focus on as well in our own community. And again, like pretty much every other place that has decriminalized it at this point, we are really trying to focus on the potential of psilocybin and other naturally produced psychedelics in the treatment of mental health, and some even medical diagnoses amongst adults. So again, this is not giving wholesale psychedelic use to every single individual, and we are still strongly encouraging minors to not be using psychedelics at this time. So in the grand scheme of things, what does this mean for Somerville? We are obviously going to be continuing to focus on not just with psychedelics, but in general, a shift away from legal consequences of substance use and towards potential treatment. However, as I mentioned earlier, psychedelics, you still cannot sell them commercially. They still cannot be used in public areas, especially around schools, parks, etc. Driving under the influence of psychedelics is still very illegal, and using or causing disturbances because of psychedelics in public is still not encouraged and is still definitely not something that you should be hopefully doing outside of a safe space, probably home. Now, let's also talk about mental health and psychedelics a little bit more. So like I've mentioned earlier, we are especially doing a lot of research into psilocybin, which for those of you who have forgotten, that is traditionally found in magic mushrooms and other fungi found in nature. And I think that there is going to be a lot more research being done on this, especially as decriminalization continues to move more and more and more along the way. My one thing I would caution people to think about is, and this is not an experience that will necessarily impact every single psychedelic user, but there is something that we kind of call the serotonin dump, meaning if you have taken psychedelics and you are taking it for the purposes of, kind of creating a more euphoric mood, you may notice a very quick shift to being depressed after coming down completely off of your psychedelic high, because your body has kind of run through its entire supply of serotonin in response to the psychedelic entering your body. So while we are still doing a lot of research around psilocybin and depression, I would just caution people, for people who have particularly low levels of serotonin in their brain, this may be something that you need to keep in mind if you are thinking about psychedelics as a potential treatment option for yourself. This kind of in turn leads us nicely into harm reduction. And this, obviously, we've mentioned before, is going to be very closely tied to decriminalization with substance use in general in our city. We also are going to want to continue to really focus on making sure that people are making informed decisions and well-educated decisions about supervised medical use of a psychedelic versus harmful misuse. I will also point out that, again, psychedelics are used very differently by different people, again, whether that be for a spiritual purpose, a medical purpose, a mental health purpose, or a strictly social recreational drug use purpose. The other thing to think about too is, obviously there is always a risk of accidents for people who are under the influence of psychedelics, just because you are experiencing potentially some major changes to your perception of reality. This in turn can lead to some, shall we say, extremely poor decision making. I would even say just putting yourself potentially into unsafe situations. And we are also strongly discouraging minors. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. We are strongly discouraging minors from trying out psychedelics just because of brain development. We want to make sure that we are encouraging people under the age of 25, 26 to really do their best to stay away from substances so their brains have their full time and ability to just kind of naturally grow and be as healthy as possible. Moving right along, again, when it comes to harm reduction, there are definitely ways in which I think psilocybin especially is going to continue to be utilized for medical purposes in the future. But again, you want to really be thinking about harm reduction in the sense of the impact potentially of a psychedelic on your safety, on your emotional and mental well-being, and keeping in mind that there is definitely a very real sense of reward, but also of risk when it comes to any kind of substance use, but especially with psychedelics. So the interesting thing that I found in doing a little bit more detailed research with this is most psychedelics do not appear to cause physical dependence or withdrawal symptoms, which does make them slightly different from other substances that are currently out there on the street. I would say in particular, from all of the research that I have done, it does seem like there are also major risk differences between man-made psychedelics like ketamine and other anesthetics and, ecstasy and Molly versus, again, psychedelic mushrooms, fungi, plants, etc., that are found in nature. However, at the same time, long-term psychedelic use of any sort of psychedelic can lead to increased tolerance, similar to any other really substance that can be used. Overdoses are very rare, however, they can occur, and they are especially common in combination with other substances. So again, when I was looking at the demographic data, I didn't have anything specifically around greater Boston area psychedelic overdoses, but from national and international research studies that I looked at, alcohol definitely seems to be a very commonly comorbid substance found with psychedelics when it comes to hospital overdose admissions. Also cocaine, so stimulants are also going to be something else to keep in mind as well if you are looking for kind of the comorbid substance use piece when it comes to psychedelics. Now, risks of use, I have quite a list here, but again, as I had mentioned just a few moments ago, I definitely noticed a huge amount of difference between man-made versus synthetic risks when it comes to psychedelic use. PCP, for instance, we're looking at the potentials of very severe memory loss, extreme weight loss, speech difficulties, significantly worsened anxiety and depression, and also suicidal ideation with MDMA. Again, looking at some very similar symptoms, as well as some very, very severe withdrawal symptoms that can include psychosis and extremely erratic, potentially violent behavior. Chronic ketamine use, which again, not as common up here in the Northeast, but definitely very common in the American South. Chronic use can lead to some very severe kidney failure issues, as well as potential long-term memory loss. And other psychedelics, I do want to mention this, not because it is a potential individual risk for people, but just because this is another risky way in which it is used. Certain psychedelics, especially ketamine and GHB, are becoming quite well known as date rape drugs. So we may be seeing a lot more of that, especially amongst our college students and people who are going to bars, clubs, etc., unfortunately. Nope. And that's just some other information on ketamine right there. So when it comes to treatment, right now, we do not actually have any kind of formal treatment for psychedelics at this time. Obviously, medical intervention may be required based on the severity of symptoms, especially if we're looking at an emergency room admission. Again, I would say probably what would happen in most cases is the individual in question would probably need to be detoxed of other substances. And then it's almost kind of a waiting game to see what the long-term and short-term symptoms of the psychedelic use might present themselves as. Outpatient counseling and recovery support groups may also be somewhat helpful to individuals who are looking to reduce or stop their psychedelic misuse. But we still have a long way to go in terms of really understanding what is going to be the most effective form of treatment when it comes to psychedelics, especially the more that we continue to research it for potential medical purposes. And on that note, actually, we have reached the end of our presentation already. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor up to our audience questions. If anyone has any, please do feel free to send them into the chat box right now, and I would be happy to answer them to the best of my ability. We are seeing some things here. Okay. So a question I just got in the chat box. So is psychedelic use good or bad? That's an excellent question, and definitely one in which I tried my best to kind of explore the nuances of right now. I would say, honestly, it depends. If you are someone who is using under the direct supervision of a licensed medical provider, this would probably be the best place to start if you are someone who is interested in the medical benefits of psychedelics. Again, that is still something that is slowly gaining traction amongst the medical community, but I would still say probably your best bet would be to try and find one of those providers. Obviously, when it comes to recreational or misuse of psychedelics, again, I cannot emphasize enough, we are still very much trying to deter minors from using psychedelics in any condition, and there's always going to be potential risks of finding and buying and using psychedelics that have been purchased through the street black market industry. That can lead to some very potentially dangerous risks and side effects for you. So I would definitely say we are definitely not encouraging the practice of that in any casual way. But again, if you are interested in maybe seeing if there are any medical benefits to you, please talk to your doctor. Here's another question from the chat box. So like any other drug, dose and frequency matter? Yeah, absolutely. So for instance, one of the things I had mentioned earlier is that taking, we'll say in this case, magic mushrooms, for instance, it can take, again, anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour before you really start to feel the effects of the psychedelics in your body. Now, some people, especially first-time psychedelic users, who sometimes don't know better, it's kind of like a similar situation I've seen with people who are using edibles for the first time, where edibles, you might take one and think to yourself, oh, I'm not feeling anything, so I just need to take more, not realizing that, marijuana edibles actually can take quite some time to actually present themselves to you in your body. With, again, magic mushrooms, very similar experience. So I would say the more experienced substance users are aware of that and kind of take that into account, but other more inexperienced substance users may not be very aware of that. So I would also say definitely frequency is another really key component here, because the more that you are using a substance, the more you start to develop tolerance for it. The more tolerance you start to develop for it, the more you may feel that you need to take just in order to try and kind of seek out that euphoric or creative high. So that can definitely lead to some consequences, especially risky consequences, if you are using psychedelics in combination with other substances. So very good questions. Anyone else in terms of questions? These are really good ones. Okay, just got another one in the chat box. So if psychedelics have potentially have negative consequences, why are they being decriminalized? Okay, that's another really excellent question. So I'm going to start by saying that, again, we are decriminalizing not just psychedelics, but also other substances, because there is the potential of medical treatment possibilities with some of these substances. And that is something that we need to do a lot more research into to see whether this is a safe long-term option for individuals who are interested in using them for medical purposes. The other big part of this that I do want to mention, and this is actually one of the main driving forces behind why Somerville City Council decided to decriminalize psychedelics a few months ago, we are really, now understanding, given the severity of the substance use problem in America, that oftentimes criminalizing substance use is not the most effective response to really, making a change in people's ability to access treatment or to receive care or to even receive education so that they can make more healthy decisions for themselves. We need to be treating substance use across the board with compassion, empathy, and education and respect, and not with legal ramifications, especially because substance use and criminalization issues have a very long history of racism and any number of other cultural factors that are quite political. So again, we are really trying to decriminalize, and focus on getting people help. So again, excellent question. Thank you so much to everyone who has submitted a question so far. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to direct towards me? I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. Thank you. I guess I am trying to sound knowledgeable. Do we have any social media platforms? That is definitely something I can actually show you right now in this next slide, oh so conveniently. So we are now on Facebook, we have Instagram, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, we are also on YouTube. And we also have a link down to our own Somerville Prevention Services website through the City of Somerville webpage. And that is the very last link down at the bottom. We are most commonly on Instagram these days, I will mention. So definitely, if you are looking for more information about future events like this, more educational information, collaboration projects that we are working on with other agencies, definitely you will hear about that first on our Instagram page. So that is at Somerville Prevention on Instagram. We hope that you will be following us there. We are trying to do things obviously quite remotely just because of the pandemic, but we will definitely be continuing to utilize our social media platforms quite heavily moving forward into the future. And here, for those of you who may be interested, if you want to screenshot this for later reading purposes, there are some quite interesting articles that I found just in terms of, again, some of the history and the decriminalization activities that are currently going on in America. So again, screenshot that if you are looking for some somewhat light reading later on. And here also are a couple of other fact pages that you might be interested in. I will mention, I believe one of them is actually the Australian substance use prevention page, that third link right down there, but all really, really good reading. And these are a little bit more clinical on the first page. So just kind of keep that in mind if you are interested in pursuing these. And with that, we are actually at the end of our event for tonight. I will be staying on a little bit longer to answer any potential questions. And if not, thank you again so much for coming in tonight. Our next training is actually going to be on June 17th, 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We will be doing an introduction to methamphetamine training that night. I hope you will be able to make it. We will be sending out reminders of this event on all of our social media pages, which again is facebook.com/Somerville Cares, Instagram @Somerville Prevention, and you can continue to watch us here on YouTube after our live events are done. So again, that for YouTube is Somerville Prevention Services. And if that is it, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Please do feel free to reach out to us via our social media if you have any further questions. And thank you again for being a wonderful audience. As always, hope you have a great night and please continue to stay safe.